Meeting at Night by Robert Browning. The grey sea and the long black land, and the yellow half moon large and low, and the startled little waves that leap in fiery ringlets from their sleep. As I gain the cove with pushing prow, and quench its speed in the slushy sand. Meeting at Night by Robert Browning. Robert Browning lived and wrote in the Victorian age. Remember, the Victorian age from 1837 to 1901 was a period, a long period when Queen Victoria ruled. There was a lot of activity, a lot of progress, and a lot of literature during that period. When we think of the poetry, we think of Tennyson and Browning. When we think of the novelists, we think of Dickens and Thackeray. And then, of course, you have critics like Arnold, who lived and wrote at the same period. It was known as the Golden Age too, but there was one conflict, the conflict between science and religion. Could one replace the other? A well-known poet of the Victorian era, Browning lived from 1812 to 1889. He wrote a lot of poems, but to his credit, it must be said that he popularized a particular genre that we call the dramatic monologue. It seems to combine within the poem features of drama and poetry, but more of it may be in another poem. His most noted work is The Ring and the Book. He married Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Some of you might have heard of her because remember, she herself was a poet. Many of his love poems, they say, were written during the period when he was courting Elizabeth Barrett, later known as Elizabeth Barrett Browning. How Do I Love Thee, Let Me Count the Ways is one of her most well-known poems. Of course, here we are looking at a love poem written by Robert Browning. Meeting at Night. Actually, it was a twin poem. Meeting at night, parting at morning. Of course, here we are looking only at the first part, which is meeting at night. There is an unnamed lover going to meet his beloved. Could put it the other way, because nowhere are we told whether it's the girl who's going to meet the boy or the boy who's going to meet the girl. But we certainly do know that there is water, there's a sea, the grey sea, and then there is the long black land. So there is somebody who goes by boat, probably stops the boat, and then has to walk across. It's night, we know, because it's the yellow half moon, large and low. And then there are waves which seem to be hitting on the sides of the boat. Then, of course, he reaches, I'm saying he because I think it's the lover going to meet his beloved. So he stops the boat and then has to walk along the beach to that little house where his beloved is waiting for him. How is it? It is sea-scented beach. Those of you who have been to any seashore, you know that there is a specific smell of the sea. We love it because it brings maybe memories of other seas, other beaches that we have been to. He walks across. It's night, remember? Remember, it's only the half moon, so not very brightly lit. He goes there. He knows that she is waiting for him, and he goes and knocks at the pane. The pane, the P-A-N-E, the window pane, remember. A tap at the pane, says the poet. And then there is a lighted match. So somebody's been waiting in the darkness. But now, when she hears the sound of her lover having reached, she probably lights a match and then they meet. So it is meeting at night. So it is only in the last two lines of the poem that the meeting actually takes place. And so beautifully the poet tells us that it is two hearts beating each to each. So this is now the union of the lover and the beloved on a moonlit night across the sea and the beach to that little hut, cottage, house, whatever you would like to call it. The poem begins with imagery. You know, when we look at a poem, we're always looking for figures of speech, and they could vary from one poem to the other, from one to many. Because I don't think a poet sits and decides that I'm going to have so many figures of speech or these figures of speech. As he writes the poem, the figures of speech come along to a great poet. So to Browning in this poem, the poem begins with a very beautiful imagery where he talks about the grey sea, the black island, the yellow half moon. Just imagine, in the first two lines of the poem, we have this beautiful creation of various colors of nature. And yes, there is always the sound of a language, the sound of words, which contribute to the beautiful rhythm of a poem. So here you have alliteration, large and low, little and leap, and it goes on, speed and sand. Then we have onomatopoeia, not a very common figure of speech, but a very interesting figure of speech. You have to look at the spelling too, because it's not very easy, onomatopoeia. And the best example that I can think of onomatopoeia is the hissing of the snake, where the word hiss itself gives you the meaning. I also love the swishing of silk, again, or the tinkling of the anklets. But in this poem, he uses slushy sand. Think of it when you put your feet into the sand, particularly if you're wearing footwear, the sound that comes, the slushy sand. Then, of course, there is enjambment, which many poets use, where, as we have looked probably in earlier poems, the line grammatically, in terms of meaning also, does not end where the line ends and continues on into the next line. For example, little waves that leap in fiery ringlets. And remember, if you really want to appreciate a poem, you should not stop at the end of each line, but you should only stop when there is a punctuation mark. So look at me as I read, little waves that leap in fiery ringlets from their sleep. The line ends with leap, but we continue reading on to the next line also. And then you have the synecdoche, where you have a part for the whole. So you have two hearts beating, actually referring to the two lovers. And so on in this poem, beautiful figures of speech to make the poem even more beautiful, more aesthetic than it could be without these figures of speech. The short poem of just 2 stanzas, written in 6-line stanzas, a short poem, but conveys a world of meaning. It might be interesting to look at other poems written about night, ever so many. But only night, why only night? Other parts of the day, evening, dusk, dawn, morning, afternoon, I'm sure there'd be ever so many poems. And it would be interesting to see how different poets look at the same part of the day or the night. And I would advise you, suggest that you also read some of his dramatic monologues to really understand what a great poet Robert Browning is. Then a mile of warm sea-scented beach, 3 fields to cross till a farm appears. A tap at the pane, the quick, sharp scratch and blue spurt of a lighted match, and a voice less loud through its joys and fears than the 2 hearts beating each to each.